Okay,
Speak your truth, bro.
I'm speaking my truth. This is the origins of human language, as I understand it. Okay, I'm gonna speedrun everything that I just said. Or at least everything that I don't have written down. Continuity theories. Okay, so language was probably evolved and snowballed, like over 100,000 years ago, probably between 100,000 and 200,000, or just around then. A capacity for language had evolved, coincidentally, at the same time as evolutionary pressure left the room. And yes, okay. Evolutionary pressure, there was a lot less evolutionary pressure because we were surviving more. So it allowed the language centers of the brain to develop more and to stick around. And there was probably some social stuff with that and some natural selection, not in terms of like who died and who lived, but in terms of who passed on their genes. Like if you're looking for a mate, you're going to look for a mate who who can talk, who is eloquent or something. I don't know. But like something social wise that allowed those language centers specifically to snowball and keep developing, at least in a small group of humans. Maybe that was a social or cultural thing. Because maybe they got into the point where they were surviving well enough where their brains were able to develop that in the first place. And because they were surviving well enough in order to develop that, there were less evolutionary pressures at the same time. So it's less of a coincidence and more of a side effect. So anyways, yeah, there's that. But why would language stick around, and why would it become so complex in words? Because humans are complex. Because humans, at that point, are conscious beings. Which is really interesting. So humans are conscious beings at this point. Their brains are complex. And in order to be conscious or understand themselves and be aware of themselves, it's helpful. It's very helpful to understand it through words. Because at that point, the brain is working off words because it has these language centers, at least very basic ones. And I think it's continuing to snowball during this, through like those social mating rituals, as I said earlier, and those mating preferences, for people who are more conscious, more understanding, and more self-aware, because they're able to process that through words. So that snowballs, and it's like a positive feedback loop with itself, and language gets more and more complex. Because human consciousness is so complex, and people are so complex at this point that they have to, like, in order to communicate and socially interact with other people on a deep level, for purposes of mating, perhaps, for other purposes that were originally evolutionary, and now we're just still there, like how we still have them, like how we still have friends, even though that can be traced back to like an evolutionary advantage. They still have that, obviously, because we still have it. And they want to form deeper social bonds. So they develop complex words. And the ones who do that mate with the ones who do that and have kids who are better at that. And that snowballs over time. I think. Side note about the people who didn't have that, maybe, language centers. It's hard to say. But like I said earlier, they weren't surviving as well, so they couldn't have developed the language centers in the first place. So that sort of naturally selects them out and naturally selects for bigger brains, which happens to include language centers as they get I mean, at that point, it's not even natural selection. It's artificial selection because it's people choosing it just in themselves without even, like, realizing. Well, like, I guess it's purposeful, but not with the intent of changing their genome. You know what I mean. Anyways, in order, like I was saying, in order to convey the complexities of the human experience, of the conscious experience with other people, you need words. There is no other way to convey that specific kind of data without words, or at least some sort of complex language. I don't care if it's Morse code. I don't care if it is clapping. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's clicking. It is something that can be complex and that can be interpreted as data. So it has to be complex enough to be data, because data is complex enough to convey those complex feelings and perspectives and understandings that come with conscious beings. And vocalization just happens to be something that can be evolved and practiced relatively easily, and it is complex enough to create data. So yeah. So language kept snowballing and snowballing, and the ones who were surviving were the ones with the language because they had enough food to actually have enough brain power in the first place. And then we left Africa, and at that point, which was around 100,000 years ago, we had enough, we had enough language and stuff. And maybe it's interesting to think that Neanderthals, who were around at the same time in this period, could have also been developing language any time before they disappeared. By disappeared, I mean went extinct 40,000 years ago. But I feel that in order for something to develop language, like I said, it has to be complex enough to have a need for complex language, unlike the animals that we see today. Like I said, with whales, they're not complex, they're not conscious, they're not that complex. I mean, they have very complex whale sounds, but it's nowhere near as complex as human languages because it doesn't need to be, because they have no social or evolutionary pressure for it to be. At least nowhere near as much as we did, and still do. But animals, what was I saying? Before the whales. Is there more? We leave. Oh yeah. I don't think that a species could develop language if it's not conscious. Because I think being conscious is the only way that's complex enough to require or be able to develop a language. And I think, obviously, even then, in order to develop language centers, language capabilities in the first place, they need enough, food. They need to be able to grow bigger brains and get to the point, which happens to be the same point or around there, where there is no evolutionary, where they don't have to worry about evolutionary pressure anymore, at least with natural selection, because they're obviously surviving, getting enough food that they're okay, and that they can build bigger brains. And this is happening at the same time. So I think that if Neanderthals did have language, that either if it was complex, then they would have developed consciousness as well, or if it wasn't complex, then maybe they didn't develop consciousness. And I'm not sure if Neanderthals have developed consciousness or not, or what. Some signs point to yes, but I would have to do more research on that. If they did, I don't know if that is something that developed before we split off in that evolutionary tree, since they're the closest that we know to humans. But also, I don't know when human consciousness originated. That's a whole other thing. And it could have been way before, and maybe all the other Homo species, or at least more than just our species, were conscious and and technically could have developed a language at some point. if they were capable. But also, I mean, I think out of all of them, Neanderthals did the second best to us, of course. But out of all of them, Neanderthals did the best. Because they got to that point. I'd have to do more research to see if Neanderthals show enough complexity for me to make the presumption that, or conclusion, that they are, or had developed consciousness. Which is honestly a really interesting thing, because it's weird to think, at some point, conscious humans were interacting with and even mating, for lack of a equivalent word, for lack of a better word, mating with Neanderthals. That's really interesting in a concept to me, that 100,000 years ago, like, if I time traveled back then, and I was a baby, there would be no difference, because at that point we are anatomically the same around 100,000 years ago. I think I'd have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure at that point there's very little difference. So it's a very interesting concept to think, would I have mated with a Neanderthal? And it's very interesting to think what kind of interactions they might have had, and how they thought of each other, especially, I mean, I don't think humans would have mated, at least not that much, with anything they didn't also think was conscious and complex enough, to at least have some sort of language, in a way. Because like I said, at that point, they would have had to have been complex enough to have language, and like I said, there was pressure, not evolutionary pressure, but like social and mating pressure to mate with people who were just as complex as you and were able to convey that complexity in social interaction by communicating through words, which are complex enough to do that. Which makes me think, and obviously, I know the interbreeding didn't happen a lot, but it did happen a significant enough amount that we have noticed that it happened, like in DNA, which is really interesting to me. And it makes me think that Neanderthals were conscious. Yeah. And I can just imagine a human society where they were living alongside. I don't think they lived in the same tribes, but also we know nowhere near enough about our own history at that point, especially, or not even like Neanderthal history at that point. Not to mention the Devonians, who were also around at that point, and the other primate groups in Homo that were around at earlier different points. I'd have to do more research on that, but it's interesting for me to think that we lived on the planet at the same times and interacted with other conscious beings, possibly, that were not the same species as us. It's very interesting to me. So yeah, that's my TED Talk.